This is a Momentum Media production.
Welcome to the Smart Property Investment Show, the podcast by investors for investors.
G'day everyone, it's Liam Garman here, Managing Editor of Real Estate here at Momentum Media, the team that brings you the Smart Property Investment Show. And given a lot of discussion, a lot of debate that's been happening over the last few weeks in the world of politics, I collared our government affairs manager at Momentum to discuss all things politics in the world of property at the moment, given the amount of chatter around changes to capital gains tax, changes to negative gearing. Steve Kuper, our government relations manager, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mr. Garman. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be back on the property podcast. I haven't done one in nearly 4, maybe 5 years.
Half a decade almost.
Yeah, it's nice to be back.
Long-term listener, second-time caller.
Yep, exactly right.
Now, I think the best place to start is just hours ago, we're seeing the smoke settle on the Queensland election. And look, I think, Steve, I'll throw across to you in just a second, but perhaps not as big of a win for the LNP as one would have thought. However, the numbers are still coming in perhaps out of the realm of tradition. The LNPs actually performed really well in that pre-poll, really well in that postal vote. Now, traditionally in Australia, they have performed well in the postal vote, but in the early voting, they performed very well. As the dust settles, we're still counting those early votes, but it's about 54% two-party preferred to the LNP. On a numbers basis, massive win. As the seats fell, not as strong. It seems like there's a lot of vote clustering. People in the regions are hurting behind the LNP. People in Brisbane are hurting behind Labor. Steve, what do you make of the election?
It was definitely an interesting outcome. It was very interesting to see no Greens wins, which is that's very interesting, and that'll be one to watch come the federal election, which we know is due between now and May, June time next year. And particularly with the Greens as a federal party, their focus on housing affordability, rent to buy, as well as their targeting of property investors as a whole, come election time, to see whether or not that the Greens vote collapses as it has done with the in the Queensland State Parliament. Now, actually, I should correct myself. There is, as of right now, or as of 2:12 p.m. on the 28th of October, the Greens have retained one seat. So that really would have come out over the last few minutes, because I was reading before that there was complete electoral wipeout for them. Yes. So, but still not a crash hot performance by them. ALP have obviously lost government, and it's interesting given the amount of largely populist kind of political manoeuvrings by Stephen Miles. I'm thinking things like the 50-cent public transport fares and the free school lunches program that he was proposing to deliver should Labor win at the election didn't really make much of a difference at the end of the day.
It is an interesting divergence, because the Greens performed decently well in the 2022 election in Brisbane CBD and received a lot of support, especially around that South Bank area. And you saw perhaps what could have been perceived as a little bit of a real problematic moment for the Labor Party, where they're losing their progressive voters to the Greens simultaneously as those traditional Labor strongholds in central Queensland and in North Queensland, which typically have been swing seats at best for the coalition, or at worst, dead red seats. There seems to be really no inkling that Labor has any foothold in the near future, no inkling that they'll ever be in for a fight again. And meanwhile, Brisbane seems to be splintering back, or splintering into Greens territory. You mentioned that there was that element of economic populism before. Obviously, Adam Bandt and Chandler, Maxwell coming out very heavily attacking negative gearing, saying that they'll cap negative gearing to the one owner, even in areas with big levels of rentals. It doesn't seem like their economic populism has really gotten them many votes.
Well, you are right on that assessment. And I think it's also because despite the lack of clear financial education in Australian schools, young people seem to be grasping the concept that, oh, well, if you're removing negative gearing incentives for property owners, they're going to have to then subsequently put up the rates at which I pay to rent. So there's a direct economic pull through there that young Aussies are waking up and going, hang on a second, this doesn't make sense for us. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting and watching some of the electorates in and around metropolitan Brisbane swing back and forth between all three parties is very interesting, particularly given some of the losses at the 2022 federal election for the coalition. They lost a number of seats in the Brisbane metro area, which ultimately also cost them government. So it will be very interesting to see how that plays out moving forward as we head into a federal election, which is going to be largely dominated, I think it's safe to say, by housing as one of the core, if not the deciding factor in this federal election.
Now we have the Greens with a 0% swing towards them. So I'm going through the numbers now. Greens are at 0. So real no numbers coming to them, no real numbers going against them. One would hazard a guess that in an election where you have had incumbents in for 9 years, which there will be that element of fatigue coupled with now Anthony Albanese is going on to his third year. There's a natural tendency for voters to say, well, now it's time to give the others a go. That always tends to happen after a long time. It seems that Greens have picked up no real progressive vote from Labor and that it was a clean swing from Labor to the LNP on one hand and minor right-wing parties on the other, though this probably is the one election where Labor and Stephen Miles seem to have grasped onto that economic populism as well that we've seen with the Greens. Steve, policies like the 50% fares, now that seems par for the course. Obviously, Daniel Andrews has done similar policies in Victoria with free trams between certain parts of the city. But there were policies, Steve, which really just made my jaw drop, which was the publicly owned petrol stations. And this publicly owned petrol station, I think the rule was it can only move up and down 5 cents each day unless it has a very good reason. Something along those lines. It could only really move 5 cents a day, which was truly a jaw-dropping policy because, you know, a lot of petrol prices, now we're getting off topic, but petrol prices driven by global instability and what is literally supply and demand of global oil. You know, what if there was conflict overseas where you saw the price of oil double overnight, which we've seen in the past? We saw global oil spikes as far away as OPEC, but as recently as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That would have left a state government with seemingly billions and billions and billions of dollars in liabilities, which it seems to me that it sounds nice, it's all good and well, but the second that there would be any kind of global economic or financial vicissitudes, that policy would have been just absolutely canned on day one.
Yeah, what's that old saying? Last one in, first one out.
Yes, yeah. Especially when it's the tax dollars that are underpinning it. And to your point about the economic rationalism that people saw Greens policies with, I think there was perhaps a similar pushback against some of those Labor tactics because given that you've been in government for 9 years, if you have all these great ideas, well, you've had 9 years to do them. And perhaps a lot of voters in the dying days, even though, yes, the polls did close, and I think that Chris Foley and the LNP would have expected a few more seats, that people did largely look past the vote buying mechanisms and hold on to voting for the LNP. Though, again, we have to taper that level of conservative outlook. I mean conservative outlook in terms of who won what seats, because it seems that, yes, it will be a slim majority for the LNP. But 54% of the two-party preferred at a state level is actually quite a large win. When you go back throughout the history of state-by-state voting, yes, while Queensland does typically vote for the LNP at a federal level, ever since Joe Bjelke-Petersen, it has really been a swing state at a state level. Actually, I think, Steve, you correct me if I'm wrong, really, it was only in the last decade. You've only had really 3 years of LNP government. So you could actually argue at a state level, Queensland is typically a Labor area. Because it was Campbell Newman that won, and he was only in for one term. And then Peter Beattie and everyone before him, they were in for about 3 terms themselves.
Yeah, I think that's probably a safe assessment to make. It is a interesting predicament and indictment on Australians who are now waking up to the realisation that, governments can't continue to spend the way that they're spending. And we're seeing the follow-on implications of that in the underlying inflation numbers, where large state government spending, in particular in infrastructure, is keeping the inflation prices relatively high. It's also then having flow-on effects to the costs of building new houses, as a lot of people who work in the construction industry are deferring to large public sector infrastructure jobs because, quite frankly, they're paid better.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note of large-scale economic policies and perhaps vote buying, which some people could use the term, I'll use vote buying, but we saw only recently the Greens and a few Labor supporters, backbenchers, taking aim at the RBA, encouraging them to artificially lower interest rates. Steve, what is the risk if the RBA lowers interest rates too soon?
I think on some of our sister products, I've been quite open in saying that my concern is that we end up in stagflation. Or at least a period of stagflation, which I think we are heading towards anyway. If global interest rate pressures continue to mount, and that is, the US Fed cuts rates again, Canada does, New Zealand does, we will see the inflation rate in Australia continue to rise, and that will only get worse and be compounded by the level of state government spending. We know we've seen a dramatic collapse in the level of productivity within the Australian economy. And then subsequently, we will be in a very troubling period of negative feedback where stagflation will set in, and we will be facing essentially similar to what Japan struggled with for most of the 1990s after the Asian financial crisis.
Yeah. Now, this is, you will create that kind of inflationary spiral. I think it's fair to say already the RBA has come out highlighting that a majority of inflation, or a majority of those figures that contribute to inflation rather, are coming from government expenditure. So we have this snapshot at the moment in Australian economic management where you have fiscal and monetary policy just complete in alignment. They're just simply not aligned. You have a government which is saying that it's trying to cut cost of living. You have an RBA which increased interest rates to get a cap on the cost of living. But it seems to me that if the government was serious about getting the cost of living under wraps, you would cut spending. There is no ifs, no buts about this. You've had every major financial institution, or most, sorry, not every, that's not fair, but you have had most financial institutions, major financial institutions in Australia come out saying that you have this demand-led inflation because of the amount of money going out into the economy. You've had the RBA and essentially endorse that finding, saying, well, yes, most of the inflation is coming from rampant government spending, putting money into the economy, of which there should not be as much. And yet there doesn't seem to be any impetus to change that.
Yeah, so there's somebody, an economist that I listen to, Leif van Onselen, refers to this as burnout economics. And I quite like that term because what it essentially would do is reveal to Australians and to the Australian public that the emperor has no clothes.
Mm.
And that is that fundamentally the Australian economy is built on really three things: raw resources and agricultural exports, which, that goes without saying. Our services economy, which is basically now, for all intents and purposes, university fees for foreign students, as well as some elements of financial services and the NDIS. And then the big one is property speculation.
Mm.
And the majority of Australians, the majority of their wealth is caught up in the family home.
Yeah.
Now, Phil, our co-host, and I, we've had many a heated debate over this, and I consider that to be an unproductive form of capital, because realistically, your house doesn't really produce anything. It doesn't invest in manufacturing. It doesn't invest in productivity increasing forms of economic growth. And for a lot of people, and particularly a lot of young people trying to get into the market or who got into the market either during COVID or just prior to COVID, they're finding that the interest rates for their family home, for their stake in the great Australian dream, is now becoming a noose, which means then there are first, second and third order economic effects that flow through the economy. So we've seen comparative reduction in consumer sentiment, consumer purchasing, which will be very interesting to monitor as we come into the Christmas period. And then, of course, with declining economic confidence, we start to see broader economic trends across the national economy as a whole start to really come unstuck. And then for a government, what that means is they then have to, they're caught between a rock and a hard place. Now, there is a tried and true model of blaming your predecessor, although now we're 2 and a bit years into this term of government. I don't think that the blaming your predecessor is really going to fly in this instance. However, I do think it is fair to say that successive generations of Australian governments have let the economy down and let the nation down, and we are rapidly approaching banana republic territory.
I think that's very reasonable, especially with our over-reliance on a very uncomplicated and non-complex economy. We're going to take a quick break, and when we're back, Steve, I'm going to touch on something that you mentioned, especially around our education exports. We'll be back in just a second. Liam Garman, Steve Kuper here on the Smart Property Investment Show, and today we're unpacking the crazy world of politics that is surrounding Australia's property market and investment in property. And just before we went on our break, we were looking at the Queensland election and some of the rhetoric surrounding interest rates versus, the government versus the RBA on interest rates. And Steve, one thing that I think it's pertinent to refer this back to is let's look at the supply side as well, because typically, I think it's reasonable to say that government intervention in interest rates or a tax on the RBA is very much a demand-side phenomenon. Now, let's look at the supply side. So we have the government coming out with their National Housing Accord. Now, I think everyone's pretty familiar with it by now, but the National Housing Accord aims to build 1.2 million well-located homes. I have to add that was in the Commonwealth wording, well-worded homes over 5 years from mid-2024. So those 1.2 million homes will be coming on board by the end of the decade. Steve, already a few industry associations have highlighted that we're simply not on track to reaching our 1.2 million new homes. It looks like we're going to be falling in the 900s. Now, Steve, get this, because this is where the supply-demand aspect, this is where we're simply not going to hit that equilibrium. So roughly 600,000 arrivals per year in Australia. That's on average, I think we were at 400,000, 500,000 a few years back. Then it moved up to 700,000. I think it's fair to say we're equaling at around 600,000 new arrivals per year in terms of migration, which sums to about 3 million people in the time zone that we're building 1.2 million homes, and we're simply not hitting it. That is also not including natural population growth.
Well, on the natural population growth, I would say that I would add that recent data out of the ABS is actually showing that we have no natural population growth. And some data, some analysis done. I can't remember. Forgive me. I can't remember the name of the economist who did it, but they were showing that for every 1% increase in the interest rates, there was a correlating 10% decrease in the number of children a woman would have through her life. So, there's no natural population growth going on in Australia at this point.
To counterbalance that, yes, at this point, perhaps with people having graduated from university, finishing their trades, I mean, these people would be in their early 20s, we would have had some element of population growth 20 years ago. I mean, you actually touched on this earlier. Those were the Howard years, right?
Yeah. So what we've seen is that during the Howard Costello years, we saw the baby bonus, which resulted in a population growth, no doubt. And so what the figures have shown is that now that there's obviously a changing of the number of house, a changing in the size of houses in Australia, and by that they mean the number of people living in the homes. So if Australia's population was to just continue its growth along the normal trajectory as per the Howard Costello baby boom, Australia would only require 65,000 new homes.
Yeah, over that same time period.
So it is very much a demand-driven problem, and that is compounded by the supply side issues.
Yeah, I simply can't make it work. I think you're 100% right that it is a demand-driven problem because the numbers don't seem to completely align. So if we're expecting 600,000 arrivals a year, half a decade, that sums to 3 million people. And you're totally right. With the size of the average dwelling, is decreasing. A lot of apartments coming into the market now are 2-bedroom apartments, not big 2-bedroom apartments, mind you. So when you have the amount of people over the next 5 years that will be entering the workforce, leaving the family home and acquiring new housing, I think it's reasonable to say that all else equal, the average house price in 5 years' time, it ain't going to be worth less tomorrow than it is today. Let's just say that.
No. And I'm just looking on Twitter now, and a fairly average red brick, I wouldn't call it Art Deco, but it's probably around that time. House in Strathfield has just sold for $12.5 million.
Yep.
Now, there is a very big disconnect between wages and what houses are worth. Now, you can't tell me that young people want to live in a 2-bedroom, sky-high dog box, for a lack of a better term, and raise children in it. It's just not feasible.
It's impossible in a lot of instances. But we're for property investors. We're discussing property investment, and it just seems to me that the data on the supply side is clear that the demand, at least into the future, projecting it into the future, I do not see an instance here where demand will ever meet supply, or supply will ever meet demand. Sorry.
No, it won't. And that comes back to my point around the Australian government then having to prove, or then having to confront the fact that more people does not necessarily equal better economic growth and more economic growth. And that we know that at a per capita level, Australia's per capita wealth has been declining dramatically. And a lot of Australians are feeling that. And then that is only compounded by price of housing, the price of electricity, and then your average cost of living, like going to the shops, is bloody expensive now.
Yeah.
So how can we expect people to rent investment properties from people and to buy a home, or to take the punt and develop real estate to then subsequently support young Australians or new migrants? We can't realistically expect that.
We're going to go to a quick break and we'll be back just shortly. And we're back. Liam Garman, Steve Kuper, unpacking the recent elections and Australia's economic fortunes. And given all of this, we've noticed that Australians are tightening up their belts amid a cost of living crisis. Steve, you're a property investor yourself.
Yes.
It's a long-term financial game that you're playing. And it must be hard sometimes to personally justify this financial strategy with prices of property investment going up, whether it's through interest rates or even just regular maintenance. Talk us through how you've been managing your properties over the last 6 to 12 months.
Well, in large part, I am fairly lucky to have very, very good property managers. I think that's a really big component of making sure that any investment property is managed properly. My sister-in-law and her wife, they rent, and they've just moved out of the Sydney metro area up to the North Coast, and they were telling me some horror stories about their landlord, which quite, as a landlord myself, quite frankly, terrified me. Just delays in getting things done, getting maintenance done, making sure that a home was livable. And I see a lot of criticism, particularly in the media, around landlords who take advantage of their tenants, which is they shouldn't be doing that. There is some degree of morality that has to be involved there, and you don't want to see your asset devalue to the point through neglect, because it's only going to cost you more to get it repaired in the long run. Then obviously, there's the managing of your strata fees and your rates and those sorts of things. So juggling that plus juggling my family home mortgage, it's taken a lot of effort and a lot of skill. And also working with my local councils, as well as working with my strata providers and things like that. I've just had a new baby, so things are tight. So it's also a matter of working with your strata providers and your real estate agents to deal with those expenses as they arise in a timely manner, but doing it in a way that doesn't leave you out robbing Peter to pay Paul.
It's a good reminder, because I think a lot of people do tend to forget that you're dealing with an asset that is yours, and if you don't keep it up, it will degrade over time. Think about your own body as an example. If you notice something that, I'm sick, well, you go to a doctor. Well, not all of us. Some of us might take years to go to the doctor. But ultimately, it is on you if you fail to go to the doctor and your body degrades. It's a good reminder that cost cutting and trying to save by cutting a corner ain't always good in the long run.
No. And particularly when, we've had past couple of years, we've had a lot of rain. And I know a number of people who deal with rising damp issues and things like that. Those sorts of things beyond the immediate health issues can present some significant impacts to structural integrity, requiring carpet replacements, which aren't cheap, flooring replacements, which aren't cheap. And then if they're left to fester, you can end up having to pull a house down. Now, obviously, it gets that's the extreme scenario, but it is a matter of making sure that you're on top of your maintenance. Work with your real estate agents, work with your strata property managers, work with council to make sure that you're on top of those things. And And if you need to, don't be afraid to ask for help and ask for financial leniency to come up with a payment plan or whatever it is to make sure that you can meet your financial obligations without robbing your current living standards too significantly.
No, that makes total sense. Mate, I think that is all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Not a problem. Hopefully this one performs better than my last one. But
I've heard about this infamous last investment podcast that you were on, Steve, and apparently it wasn't, this is from your own mouth. It wasn't everything that you hoped it was going to be.
Yeah, it was. Emma and I, our esteemed former colleague now, we spent most of the time ragging on about Uber Eats.
Oh, good.
Yes.
That seems to be the opposite of what you should be doing, should you want an investment property.
Well, yes, exactly right. And that was the point of our episode. But
there you go. So it was on topic.
It was on topic. I just don't think we executed it as well as what we could have done.
No, that is fine. And I think, look, we had a good chat unpacking the political bubble at the moment, and of course the impact that will have on house prices. But that is all we have time for today, and we'll be back at the same time on Thursday with our next Smart Property Investment podcast. But until then, bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.
Feeling trapped by rising interest payments? Escape from mortgage prison with expert refinancing assistance from Finny. We have helped hundreds of borrowers break free from higher loan repayments by finding a more suitable loan. Our expert team can quickly assess your situation, and if there's a better lender available, we'll find it fast. Don't delay. Call today. Speak to a Finny mortgage specialist on 02 8866 2444 or visit our website at www.finny.com.au.